Get ready to take a flamethrower to the official narrative and learn what the elites don't want you to know. You're listening to The Tom Woods Show.
Hey everybody, Tom Woods here, episode 2534 of The Tom Woods Show. Dan McCarthy back here with us, Vice President for the Collegiate Network at the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. He's a syndicated columnist. I'm seeing his columns all the time, and they're always enlightening. To me, he's editor of Modern Age, the venerable journal that was founded in 1957, where anybody who's anybody on the right is or has been published. And I wanted to get him back to, it's been a while, and talk about what's going on in politics these days. So Dan, welcome back indeed.
Thanks, Tom.
So there was it was Joe Biden the last time you and I spoke. So it's a lot has changed. And I feel certain that you feel the way I do, which is that I am flabbergasted at what has happened. And I thought after living through COVID that my estimate of mankind had reached a kind of equilibrium. You know, I had come to terms with the fact that mankind was worse than I thought, but I learned to live with that, move on. And now it turns out it's even worse than that. So I guess I want to ask you, what do you think is happening here? Well, I think we all know what's the facts of the matter, that we're dealing with a nominee who in the primaries in 2020 was deeply unpopular. Nobody would have described her as charismatic. She's not particularly bright. We know what some of her opinions are. We can kind of assume the others, but the ones that she's been vocal about recently are just plain dumb. So how is it possible that all of a sudden the betting markets have it that she's probably going to win? What on earth happened?
Yeah, I mean, the Democrats perpetrated a fraud 4 years ago, which they were willing to continue all the way up until Joe Biden's implosion in front of, a live, not just a television audience, but an audience of millions of Americans watching the debate, at the end of June. So, they've known all along that Joe Biden was not capable of fulfilling the functions of being president, that he was someone who, was really showing his age, that he was very decrepit. They did not have any confidence in Kamala Harris as a nominee. They knew that if she had to go through a primary process, if they had said, you know what, Joe Biden has served one term, but he's not really up to serving a second term, therefore, we're going to ask him to step aside. We're going to have a set of primaries. We're going to have Kamala Harris as, perhaps the front runner. Certainly she would be next in line being the VP, but it's going to be an open process and we're going to let voters, make the decision. If they had done that, all of Kamala Harris's weaknesses would have come out. And those were weaknesses that we saw in 2020 when she wound up dropping out even before the first primary because she was doing so poorly as a campaigner and she was really not connecting with voters in any respect, even within Democratic primaries. Remember, Kamala Harris as a candidate in 2020, seeking the presidential nomination for the Democrats, she got blown out of the water in the debates by Tulsi Gabbard. She was just a complete failure. So the Democrats knew that, you can't substitute Kamala Harris for Joe Biden during the primaries or before the primaries without having a colossal disaster on your hands. That in fact, even Joe Biden in his debilitated state was going to be a better candidate than the candidate that Kamala Harris really is when people get to know her. What they decided, however, after Joe Biden's, humiliating performance at the end of June was that, okay, we've already had the primaries. We already have the delegates elected. The delegates are, in fact, the ones who get to say who's going to be the nominee. So if we can pressure Joe Biden to step aside, we can insert Kamala Harris into the election without having her go through a process where she has to confront voters or has to deal with rival candidates or has to even talk to the press. And that's exactly what happened. So basically, they have taken a very flawed candidate, Kamala Harris, and they have been able to sidestep the processes that would normally reveal that candidate's flaws and expose them to the entire public. I find this all very, you're right that it's something that makes you even more cynical than you may have been beforehand. But I also find that it's kind of humorously ironic just how similar this is to the whole fraud that involved Joe Biden in the first place back in 2020. That a party which was fully aware that Joe Biden was, not getting any younger and was in fact, starting to already show serious signs of deterioration 4 years ago, they went ahead and nominated him anyway because they said, well, you know what? As long as he doesn't have to go out and campaign because of the COVID crisis, as long as people are stuck in their houses, we can just, run a virtual campaign, a media campaign for Joe. He could actually win just because people have fond memories of the kind of Democrat that they think that Joe Biden was decades ago. Well, with Kamala Harris, it's kind of similar. They're not actually going to, to any extent that they can prevent Kamala Harris from having to run a conventional campaign, they're going to try to prevent that. They will just try to make her a media symbol as opposed to an actual candidate who has to interface with media questions and with voters. And I think we're already starting to see that as the inevitable closes in, and she actually does have to go out, do a few press conferences, talk to a few real voters, that the balloon starts to lose air very quickly, and this aura of inevitability that Kamala had about a week ago starts to fade away.
But nevertheless, I think a lot of us, maybe prematurely, when we saw the replacement of Biden with Kamala, I think a lot of us just thought, well, Trump will just wipe the floor with her. I mean, this is going to be an embarrassment. They must just be giving up on 2024. Look, I know you can't ever underestimate how, what the media will do, and that they'll bend over backwards to make up for her flaws and cover them up and coordinate with each other to portray her in the most favorable light. I mean, I get that. I expect that. But nevertheless, aren't you? And I know based on the answer you just gave that you're saying that maybe some of this magic dust is finally starting to wear off. But are you nevertheless, in spite of all this, still somewhat surprised?
Not exactly. I mean, the fundamentals of American elections going back more than 30 years, all the way back to 1992, is that in every one of those presidential elections, except for 2004, there have been more Democratic voters than there have been Republican voters. So the Democrats have won the popular vote in each of those elections except for 2004. So it doesn't surprise me that there's an enormous mass of people out there who are prepared to vote Democratic. Then if you look at the battleground states, if you look at places like Pennsylvania, and Michigan, Wisconsin, et cetera, you'll find, and Arizona for that matter, you'll find that Democrats have done very well in the most recent midterm election. And generally, most of these battleground states have Democratic governors. So it doesn't surprise me that the swing states, in fact, do have a propensity to vote Democrat. And it doesn't surprise me that the overall electorate also may have a Democratic tilt. What does surprise me, actually, is that Donald Trump is doing as well as he is doing in the face of all of the powers arrayed against him. So, I want to be clear here because I think that, Trump is facing an uphill battle. But I think that was going to be the natural terrain of the election no matter what. And Joe Biden, in some ways, was able to deform that terrain in a way that gave Republicans a bit more of an advantage than they would otherwise have, precisely because, Biden's decrepitude, which Democrats were absolutely determined to cover up, was something they really couldn't cover up. And therefore, a lot of Democrats who are, totally enthusiastic about the party's agenda, but who nevertheless just wanted to see basic competence, at least in the White House, when they saw Joe Biden, they said, okay, this is just beyond what I can do. And if you look at the polling numbers, what you actually see is that, it's not that Trump's numbers have changed a lot since Biden dropped out. It's rather that, previously you had two candidates who were both in the mid to upper 40s. Now you have, Kamala Harris consistently in the mid to upper 40s, occasionally even crossing the 50-point mark in some of the states at least. You have Democrats coming home, in other words, to Kamala, as opposed to a sudden influx of undecided voters who are opting for her. By the way, there's still a lot of undecided voters, and a lot of that Kamala support is actually kind of soft. So it'll be very interesting to see over the course of the next 3 months here whether that holds up, or whether the more exposure people get to Kamala, the more embarrassed even Democrats are to support her.
Dan, maybe it's just that maybe you and I are the ones who are different from everyone else, but to me, it's just hard to conceive that there could be people out there who are still thinking, do I want Trump or Harris? Like, do I want this one or that one? When it seems to me this is the kind of thing you've made up your mind about a long time ago.
Well, but Tom, think about it this way, right? So you're right that people like yourself and me, we are plugged into politics, and even people who are less plugged in than we are, if they still have some sense of what the parties stand for, who the candidates are, then probably they will have, a pretty strong lean in one direction or another. But there are an awful lot of Americans out there, and this even includes some Americans who have at least a superficial understanding of the news, who are simply looking at or, responding to the feelings they get when they hear a candidate's name or when they see a candidate's familiar face. So in 2016, when Donald Trump first became a phenomenon, people had a sense of these people who are, not so plugged in or not so intelligently, informed about politics. They saw Donald Trump as being an entrepreneur. They saw him as being a familiar face from television. And they heard his message was all about throwing out the bums in Washington whom they really didn't like. So they identified Donald Trump with change, just as they had, been bamboozled into identifying Barack Obama with hope and change back in 2008. There's a certain amount of American voters who really are going to respond to the idea of a fresh face and a change from politics as usual. And right now, unfortunately, because Donald Trump has been a presence on the political scene for 9 years, going back all the way to his, coming down the escalator in 2015, Donald Trump doesn't have the same degree of freshness in the minds of these voters as Kamala Harris has. So there's this very perverse thing happening where even though Kamala Harris and a vote for her represents a continuation of the Biden administration, and in fact, probably even making the Biden administration agenda far worse, a lot of voters who are less informed look at her and they think, oh, this is a fresh face. This is someone I don't know very much about. I haven't heard her say anything. I just hear that the media says she's wonderful. And they look at Donald Trump and they say, well, you know what? There are things I might like about Donald Trump, but Donald Trump reminds me of all of the upheavals that we've all suffered for the last 9 years. The endless number of, media attacks on Trump, the Russia collusion hoax, the impeachments, COVID back in 2020, the George Floyd riots in 2020, then, Donald Trump being indicted. All of these things are baggage that is now upon, Donald Trump's shoulders, which he didn't have back in 2016 and he has to deal with now. A lot of voters who are just naive, they feel emotionally weighed down by that. They don't want to deal with that. And so they look at Kamala Harris and they think, you know what? This is a fresh start.
I hear that. I guess I hear what you're saying. It's still, and I can already see Michael Malice shaking his head at me that I could be so naive. But the fact that it really is true that if you go to her, at least as of a few days ago, if you go to her campaign website, you really don't find anything about where she stands. You find some biographical information, but you don't really find about where she stands. That's astonishing to me, even despite what I think is a reasonably informed position on the state of the American electorate. I still find that hard to believe, and it really should bring me back down to earth that this is not a matter of people abstractly weighing the merits of various proposals and making a decision on that basis. There's something much more base about the whole process. What do you conclude from that?
Yeah, I'm not surprised that Harris thinks she can get away with that, and that, there are a lot of voters out there who will simply respond to the propaganda and the image and the symbolism of Harris, as opposed to asking, well, what does she actually stand for? And what is she going to do if she becomes president? And is she actually competent? I'm not surprised at the popular dynamics of that. What I do think is really shocking and is shameful to a degree that I had never, witnessed before, is the extent to which the media is willing to play along with this. And not only play along with it, but in fact, it kind of, set up the whole, this whole fraudulent enterprise to begin with. Now, you and I, obviously don't have high expectations for the mainstream media to begin with. We know that they're, in the tank for the Democrats normally anyway. Not just normally, but almost, under practically any circumstance. But this time, they're not even doing the bare minimum, with a handful of exceptions. They're not even doing the bare minimum to say, well, who is this person? Who is Kamala Harris? What has she done in the past? What qualifies her to be president? What does she plan to do if she becomes president? What are her positions? Why, how does she feel that she can separate herself from the, Biden administration's legacy of inflation and of wars spiraling out of control? How is Harris presenting herself as a fresh face when in fact she's been the junior partner in a very troubled administration over the last 4 years? These are the questions that the media would normally be responsible for bringing to the American public. And they have not only have they, sort of abandoned that duty, but they're actually, acting as publicity flax for Kamala Harris. And they're putting out cover story after cover story, presenting Kamala Harris as, literally a poster child, presenting her, in the same light as, the famous Shepard Fairey picture of Barack Obama, saying hope back in, 2008. Now it's the media itself, not just the campaign, that's doing this for her. That I find is the most scandalous thing. It's shocking in a way where even if you know someone is really capable of doing such bad things, the fact that they actually do them is still just on a human level a remarkable shock to the system.
You know, we specialize in forbidden history here on the Tom Woods Show, and that's why I am sure you are going to want to watch Lincoln's Quest for Empire, a brand new forbidden documentary. Discover the shocking truths buried within America's untold history in this groundbreaking documentary. It features stunning visuals and expert analyses and reveals the war's pivotal role in American history. Dr. Clyde Wilson, a personal friend of mine whom Eugene Genovese called one of the top 10 Southern historians in America, had this to say: "It is the origin of everything that troubles so many of us in America today. You'll never find a superior presentation in word and picture of what happened in those years. Learn the fate of the Puritan faith in the North and the rise of Northern heretical movements. Watch Lincoln's destruction of Southern churches. Hear of the Northern Army's rape of Athens, Alabama, and its slaves. Discover the real purpose of his Emancipation Proclamation. And finally, the forgotten 1 million freedmen who died or became critically ill from starvation, neglect, and epidemics." That's questforempire.com. I was noting that Paul Krugman, who I used to have a podcast about him with Bob Murphy, and I haven't really kept up with him because why would I? But you're aware, of course, of her proposal with regard to banning whatever price gouging is supposed to be, however you're going to non-arbitrarily define that, and supermarkets. And the best Paul Krugman can do, what he should have done is just not said anything about that one. Just let that go. Because I'm sure he knows better as an economist. Just let that go. Or even, to try to seem even-handed, you could say, look, we got to do everything possible to keep Trump out. And I have great admiration for Kamala Harris, but this is certainly a mistake. He could have said that to preserve his dignity. But instead, he said, well, now, hold on a minute. Her proposal isn't as extreme as everybody is saying. And hey, don't you remember there is such a thing as gouging? Remember the California energy market 23 years ago? The California energy market 23 years ago was the best he could do to make that sound plausible. I mean, it's like everybody's dignity is just out the window to be in the tank for her, because Trump apparently means that. Trump trumps everything. That's basically it. Yeah. Defeating him trumps absolutely everything, including my own professional dignity. I know he doesn't support this. And he doesn't have to. Like, you're allowed, like, even some Trump people are willing to say, look, I think he's the only political force right now that can hold back the worst of the left, but, I recognize that, his personnel choices can be better. Whatever, there's at least some kind of acknowledgement here, but this is just beyond the pale. Now, what do you think at this point Trump needs to do differently? What does he need to do that he's not doing right now?
Well, I'll back up a little bit and just say that, in 2016, none of the great Republican campaign professionals wanted to have anything to do with Donald Trump. They were sure that he was going to lose to Hillary Clinton, and that this would be not only a stain on them for losing a presidential election, but also if they got involved, they would be tainted by Donald Trump's reputation, and no other Republican would ever hire them. And unfortunately, beginning in 2020, but also continuing to this year, the Republican professionals have changed their minds. And now all of the people who used to lose elections for John McCain and Mitt Romney and others are glomming on to Donald Trump. And they're turning the Donald Trump campaign into as much of a conventional Republican campaign as they possibly can. That was one of the things that cost Donald Trump re-election back in 2020. It's something that is putting him in grave jeopardy right now. And you look at these campaign professionals and you realize these are guys who are going to have a job no matter what happens. They can afford to lose because they will be welcomed back by the Republican establishment after Trump. They would still rather win than lose. It's still, a very big chip. If you are a professional Republican campaign consultant to be part of a winning presidential campaign, that's a huge, boost to your salary. But they will be taken care of. They are not facing an existential risk if they lose this campaign. Trump himself, unfortunately, even back in 2016, he was not the most focused of candidates. And Steve Bannon has said that in order to get Trump to focus on immigration and talk about it more, Bannon basically almost had to hold up, 2x5 note cards saying, build the wall. That you had to keep, hammering home that slogan, build the wall, in order to get Trump to, not only talk about that issue, but also to make it enough of a soundbite and condensed enough that it would have an impact with voters. Left to his own devices, Trump tends to be very expansive. He'll talk for 90 minutes without, really focusing on just 2 or 3 points and, closing the deal on those points by themselves. And he's only gotten worse, unfortunately, in the 8 years since 2016. So Trump needs to be more self-disciplined. And the campaign, I think, needs to have more of a sense of, do or die. And they need to get Donald Trump to actually go out and campaign in the battleground states, and also maybe look at a few, long shot states, not extreme long shots, not like, California, but New Jersey, Virginia, a couple other places, and do some unexpected rallies there just to kind of attack, a point where Kamala Harris thinks that she's well defended, but in fact, she may have some vulnerabilities. In 2016, what happened was that Hillary Clinton thought that her blue wall, the states of Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania, was airtight. And what happened was that Donald Trump he held rallies in these places, and it turned out that voters were willing to upset the, sort of complacency of the Democrats and of Hillary Clinton. Right now, Kamala Harris isn't making the same mistake Clinton made. She knows very well that she has to take Pennsylvania especially, but also Wisconsin and Michigan and Arizona and a few other places very seriously. But she's perhaps not looking out for her flank on some of these other states. So I think if the Trump campaign had the same kind of energy, and if Trump himself were conducting rallies with the same sort of frequency that he was in 2016, you could actually once again have a very good setup for a Trump victory in November. But right now, it seems like Trump himself doesn't have quite the same sense of urgency that he did in 2016. Perhaps he's not having as much fun as he was having in 2016. Who could blame him after the assassination attempt and everything else? And then the campaign consists of people who, this is not the only thing they've got going on that's going to either make or break their careers. These are people who have long careers, 20-year careers already. They can afford, to see what happens no matter what.
Well, what I guess I don't understand is I thought that at least somebody like a Don Jr. did understand things a bit better than his father seems to. And I thought that included not just, his, I think, deeper understanding of the issues, but also the way a campaign ought to be run and what ought to be emphasized and where the candidate ought to be and what he ought to be doing. Do you have that same impression? And
No, I do. And in fact, Tom, I would point to the Republican convention as being a perfect illustration of what both you and I are saying. So Don Jr.'s remarks, his speech at the convention was phenomenal. It was excellent. I gave it top marks. J.D. Vance was also excellent at that convention. Trump himself, gave a kind of rambling 90-minute talk, which was meant to be the climax of the convention, but instead, frankly, was a bit of an anticlimax for just about everyone. And while it did show that, Trump had not been drained of energy by the assassination attempt on his life just a week before, nevertheless, it also showed that Trump was not, taking seriously enough the idea that you actually have to get people excited again about your campaign. You can't just coast on the idea that you're Donald Trump and everyone loves you, or that you had an assassination attempt a week before and therefore everyone's automatically going to rally to you. I think a lot of pro-Trump voices out there also took that for granted. They looked at the assassination attempt. They looked at the heroic photo of Trump, standing up from the scrum of Secret Service agents, holding up his fist and saying, "Fight, fight." And they said, how can anyone look at this and not be a Trump voter? This is going to be a landslide victory for Donald Trump. And the fact is, unfortunately, American voters are not quite as inspired as they, as we would expect them to be. And so that moment didn't change the polling nearly as much as one might have expected. Interestingly enough, the debate between Trump and Biden actually didn't change the polling immediately as much as you might have expected. Several polls which were taken right after the debate actually showed Biden, irrationally, but this is what they showed, rising by a point. So, I think the fundamentals here, which is the overall count of Republicans and Democrats in the country, is the most important thing. And then, where geographically those voters are located, especially with respect to the swing states. And beyond that, it's all about mobilization. And that's why I think Trump really has to focus on this grassroots effort. He has to personally go out to these swing states and these swing districts. So does J.D. Vance. And they have to be absolutely, as relentless. In fact, frankly, they have to work even harder than they did in 2016, because Kamala Harris now knows that something like 2016 can happen. If Hillary Clinton had been warned in 2016 what could happen in Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania and elsewhere, she would have put more resources into those states. And the margins by which Trump won were pretty darn small. And that election could have turned out differently if Hillary Clinton had been, forewarned about what could have happened. Right now, Kamala Harris thinks that she knows exactly how things stand in those battleground states and others. And so Donald Trump really has to overcome a much more intelligent, or much better informed, I should say, opponent. She's certainly not more intelligent, but she does have better information than Hillary Clinton had in 2016.
I know you were saying that he ought to get out there more, and maybe even to a few states that might be dubious, but at least are in principle in play. But is there a case to be made for just absolutely hammering at Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was the wisdom of picking J.D. Vance as the running mate, that he's someone who potentially, can connect with the blue-collar voters in those states that are likely to swing them. That said, those states, Trump, well, let me put it this way. If Trump is able to keep the states which you would expect to be red, which includes North Carolina and Georgia and perhaps Arizona. Arizona is purplish, but it's something that should be within reach for a Republican. If those three states are Republican, if they stay red in this election, then Donald Trump would only need to win one of those Rust Belt battlegrounds in order to win the White House. So he can, if he just gets lucky in one of those three, that would be enough. But right now, it does seem as if, for a number of reasons, Arizona maybe, North Carolina, according to the polling, and Georgia, according to a number of indications, these states that should be not necessarily reliably Republican, but on the margin at least Republican, are perhaps in play. Trump is still unnecessarily feuding with Governor Brian Kemp in Georgia. And, North Carolina is a state that's been a bit shaky for some time now and still seems to be even shakier now than it has been in the past. And then, Arizona, Trump is still up in some of the polls I've seen most recently, but it's by no means, solid enough for the Republicans. So Trump is going to have to, lock down the Sun Belt as well as, making a very strong play in the Rust Belt. And as I say, in 2016, it was places like Florida that were expected to be the swing states. And so both the Trump and the Clinton campaigns put a lot of effort into Florida. Trump also went to the Rust Belt, the industrial Midwest, and Hillary Clinton thought, well, that's the blue wall. Those states have gone Democrat for, practically since the George H.W. Bush administration in the 80s. Therefore, we can count on those states being blue. We don't have to do very much in order to keep them. And it turned out she was wrong. Well, this time she might be wrong about a few other states. Now, I'm not saying that Trump should make a lot of exploratory efforts, but he really needs to create a sense that he has momentum and energy, and that he is an insurgent, and that he's someone who could break through at any number of, sort of levels or any number of states, while focusing primarily exactly on those battlegrounds, which we all have known and identified. I mean, those are basically the new Florida in terms of the number of votes they have and the potential they have to swing the entire election. But I think if he just does that, if he plays a more defensive strategy, basically, he's in grave danger, because some of those marginal Republican states could be picked off. And, there could be places where he can put pressure on Kamala Harris, where if he fails to do that, she's going to have more resources to put into those battleground Midwestern states.
Another thing that's happened since you and I last spoke is the Democrats chose a running mate. What do you think about Tim Walz?
Yeah, I think Walz is a remarkably mediocre choice for the Democrats. And it's very interesting to me that when you have Democratic governors in most of the battleground states, they chose a governor of a state that isn't really in play, and a governor who doesn't have any kind of national profile. I think that's a big contrast with J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance, yes, he's an Ohio senator, and so you may say, well, what do Michigan voters care about an Ohio senator? They may be neighbors, but so what? But J.D. Vance was someone who already had a best-selling book. There was a major film made about that book. he was someone who had a national profile as a spokesman for the deplorable Americans who had been left behind. Tim Walz, on the other hand, absolutely no one had heard of him, before the day he got the nomination for VP. That's apparently part of Harris's strategy, though, that she wants to get these sort of figures who are complete unknowns like herself, in order that she can rely upon just the sheer sort of media afflatus of virtue and likability, which in fact they don't really have. So I think the more you see of Tim Walz, the more you realize, well, the guy's actually peevish and nasty and bizarre. That this is not your Midwestern uncle, but he kind of looks like somebody's Midwestern uncle, and I think that's almost enough for Kamala Harris. That and the idea that he's also he seems to be a lot smarter than a lot of other Democrats when it comes to talking to working class voters. And I don't want to exaggerate Tim Walz's strengths in this regard, or Walz's strengths in these regards, but I do think that he has enough acumen in that sense that he is able to compensate for Harris's weaknesses, right? Because if you send Harris to go talk to a lot of not Michigan Union leadership, but go talk to steelworker members or ordinary blue collar voters in the battlegrounds in Pennsylvania and elsewhere, she's going to come off as exactly what she is, a California liberal. Whereas Tim Walz, he is a Democrat who has been very left wing, very progressive, but who has successfully been able to bamboozle a lot of blue collar voters in his home state into believing that he is in fact a kind of salt of the earth, ordinary American of an earlier kind of generation.
Given the way things are going in the United States and Canada and some other places in the world, if you're not at least thinking about a plan B, I think you're making a big mistake. And I can help you to make that plan B by referring you to the Expat Money Summit, which I am so proud to be part of and presenting at this year. It's the world's largest offshore event, taking place entirely online from October 7th to 11th. It's put on by Mikkel Thorup, host of the Expat Money Show, repeat Tom Woods Show guest, and highly sought-after expat consultant with over 2 decades of experience. Honestly, Mikkel is one of the most impressive people I know, and trust me, that's saying something. Discover why international diversification is a must for those looking to preserve their liberty and wealth. There's never been a more urgent time to develop a plan B. And here's where you can learn everything you need to know about crafting your perfect plan B. How to quickly acquire a second passport, diversify your finances offshore, invest in international real estate, and get in-depth insights on geopolitics from world-renowned experts. Headline speakers include some names you've no doubt heard of: Dr. Ron Paul, Doug Casey, Scott Horton, Mark Faber, Tom Luongo, all Woods here, and many more. To reserve your complimentary ticket, head over to expatmoneysummit.com. That's expatmoneysummit.com. It's just incredible what people will fall for on the basis of mere imagery. It takes not 10 seconds to find out that he holds every predictable left-wing opinion that absolutely nobody held 20 years ago, if maybe 15. And he holds every last one of them, and he holds them to the point where, he'll shove every last one of these down your throat. And I don't know, because as you say, he has this avuncular kind of image that seems to be good enough for a lot of people. It really is true what the public choice people say about, there's so many things that are true about what the public choice people say, but when you compare how people shop for a big screen TV, they price shop and they look into features and specs and they read reviews and this, that, and the other thing. But when it comes to choosing the president, they'll pick, who's more handsome or who's more, or who's funnier or who makes recipes on TV. It's, I don't know. I'm despair. I don't know how you don't become a misanthrope observing all this. And I'm not even saying that as a joke. I'm genuinely at a loss.
No, but I think, you have and I to some degree as well, we both know the merits of libertarianism. And there's kind of a paradox here because a lot of libertarians are deeply, political people in terms of their interest in, what the exact right form of politics is supposed to be, which makes them very abnormal, even though the whole point of libertarian philosophy really is people should be able to get on with their normal lives without having to worry about the government. So there's this paradox with libertarians. And I would just emphasize, especially to libertarians listening to this podcast, that normal Americans don't care about politics. It's just, they don't think that there's any difference between the two candidates. And again, they would actually kind of agree with a lot of libertarians, perhaps, in having that kind of, casually disinterested perspective and thinking, well, they're just both equally bad, or other people might think they're equally good. But in any case, the indifference that Americans have is not just a function of ignorance, but it's a function of being busy with their own lives. And it's really the job of, people like myself and you, but really even much more the job of the Washington Post and CNN and the New York Times to make people aware, hey, wait a minute, there actually are differences between these candidates, and they actually do say things which have different outcomes depending on who gets elected. And if the media doesn't do that job, there's really very little opportunity most Americans have to discover this. I mean, as you pointed out in this podcast, they can't just go to the Kamala Harris website and look up her policy positions because there's nothing there. Or at least, as we're recording this, there's nothing there. We're recording this during the Democratic convention. So, maybe, they will be shamed into finally putting up, some policy positions of some kind. But it's remarkable. But if the media lets them get away with this, you can't blame the public for being totally oblivious.
Well, yeah, I guess that's true. And in a way, maybe this is analogous, but it reminds me of back probably 20 years ago, I gave a named lecture at the Mises Institute at their annual conference, and Morgan Reynolds was in the audience, and he had a position in the Labor Department under George W. Bush, and he said, I'm sorry, I don't believe that these bishops are simply ignorant of economics and that that's the explanation for the things they say. I don't believe that. That's not plausible. It's very easy to acquire economic knowledge. It must simply be that they want people to become dependent on the regime. They want that because that's just the way the church has always been. It just wants people dependent because then they're more easily exploited. And my answer was, if even the economists aren't good at economics, we should maybe cut some slack to the bishops. And I'm not one to cut slack to the bishops, but that was my point. That if even they aren't going to do their job, then I can't expect these people to do it. So I can see where you're coming from. I feel like I don't know what the difference is. I'm busy too, Dan. The thing is, there are a lot of things I'd like to be working on. I have a lot of projects that are not political that I'd like to be working on. But I am convinced that if Kamala wins this, that a lot of really bad things are going to happen. I think some bad things will happen if Trump gets elected. But I think a lot of really bad things will happen if she gets elected. And so I'm willing to interrupt my work to do my best to try to put a stop to this. Let's see. I should ask you one more thing before I let you go. Do you think... I remember growing up and watching the Republican... I was a nerd, Dan, and I'm a little bit older than you, but 1984, I watched the whole Republican convention, at least what was televised. I watched Jean Kirkpatrick give her Blame America First speech. I watched Reagan, of course, give his acceptance speech. I watched the whole thing, and I just loved it. I thought it was most exciting. It was thrilling. I was an absolute GOP guy. But now that we have the internet and we hear from these people a lot, and we can hear from them all the time with the click of a mouse. Do you think the conventions, you'd get this big polling bump from the conventions too? Sometimes a double-digit polling bump from your convention because it was on all the TV networks, and that's what we watched. We didn't have 817 channels in those days. We had just a few. So basically, that's what everybody watched. Do you think that the significance of the convention has declined since then?
Yeah, I do. I think, the conventions used to be, in some ways, the great debut for many of these candidates. They were people, you might have seen them on the evening news if you were watching the evening news, but an awful lot of people just had only a very dim awareness of who these figures were. The convention, suddenly you had, overwhelming coverage from the very limited number of channels that were available back then. And people said, well, okay, maybe I don't want to watch, all 8 hours of the Republican convention, but I'm aware that there's this thing called the Republican convention taking place, and that apparently, this guy named George Bush or Ronald Reagan, his name's coming up a lot. Obviously, in '84, it was a presidential re-election, so people knew who Reagan was at that time. But even, back in 1980, they would still have been, awakened to the idea that, okay, here's what the Republican Party, here's who their candidate is, here's what they stand for, et cetera. Today, again, because everything is much more diffuse, I don't think conventions have that same kind of impact. And it's partly a good thing that we're able to access more information on a more regular basis now. But it's also that, these new channels of information, which really work to the advantage of conservatives and libertarians at the beginning, they're also things that once large, left-wing, establishments are able to influence them and take control of them, become channels for 24/7 relentless propaganda. And I think you've seen this happen, for example, with CNN and other kinds of 24/7 news channels. There was a time, CNN was always, somewhat left-leaning, but you used to have Robert Novak and Pat Buchanan, these other, quite distinctly not only conservative but also very intelligent conservative figures on these, talk shows and on these news cable channels, basically providing some degree of, resistance or dissonance to this overwhelming, progressive message. Now, you have, it's shameful. You have all these sort of token Republicans. It's amazing to see, all of these, sort of former Trump administration, sub-spokesmen who get hired by the View and by these other ludicrous left-wing, programs, or by, I can name names, and there are a lot of them, of people who, got hired because they had a background at National Review or at the Daily Caller, and they were considered, oh, okay, we're going to have a token conservative. And then when they got promoted, what kind of token conservative they turn out to be? Well, more token than conservative, let's put it that way. So all of these, supposed conservative voices in the liberal media today are in fact, people who are overwhelmingly supportive of Kamala Harris. Of course, the most egregious example of all perhaps is David French. French, who, prides himself on being, an evangelical Christian who, is supposedly a social conservative. But no, he's going to go and vote for the, Harris and Walz, ticket, which is going to, have transgender surgery for minors and is going to have, abortion up to and beyond the point of birth. I mean, that's what, your, conserving conservatism, true con evangelical, David French types are, reduced to. In some ways, I even have a little bit more respect for someone as horrible as William Kristol, the prince of the neocons, because Kristol, at least you've always understood, okay, what this guy wants is war. And if he can get war with a Bush-style Republican Party, he'll go for that. And if he has to settle for war with, Biden or Harris, he'll go for that instead. But David French, the sheer unctuousness of someone like that, who has gone from being, a purported social conservative to now being, someone who's in the tank for Harris, that I think is just, beyond contempt. And of course, he's not alone. He is the most egregious example, but he is, sort of one of a huge herd that really inhabits, most of these, these formerly, mainstream legacy, media outlets. And when they do have, actual, token pro-Trump or, really, sort of right of center voices on these outlets, typically, it is a very limited script that they're allowed to read from in terms of, okay, here's a debate on points X, Y, and Z, but you can't really say anything that goes off that without, everyone shutting it down or the conversation getting derailed. It's all become a lot more like professional wrestling was, even 30 years ago. It is all, people think they know exactly whether you're a heel or a face and what moves you're going to make and who's going to win the championship belt. All of that is basically baked in to begin with. By the way, I'll give you an example here. I don't know if this was something I talked about in a previous podcast, but 4 years ago, I used to get invited onto a number of media outlets that needed someone to speak up, making the case for Trump. And so, okay, all right, I would do that. This included, some very, it included state broadcasters of some of the Five Eyes, let's put it that way, some of the, sort of leading Anglo-American voices of, respectability. And unfailingly, what these media outlets, whether they were American or whether they were Canadian or British, what they always set up was a rigged panel of 4 people. So you would have the moderator, who of course would actually be center left. You would have me as the token, Trump person. You would have, supposedly the token Biden-Harris person. And then this is the really clever part. They would have an independent expert, an academic who was there to talk about what this means for politics. And of course, that academic always was someone who was well to the left of the center. So when you factor in the fact that the moderator was perhaps not so moderate, this creates a 3-against-1 panel every time. And if and up to a point, they're willing to tolerate you and let you say what they expect you to say for Donald Trump. But if you start saying things that are unexpected, you're going to have all three of those other voices shut you down and say, "Oh my God, that's the craziest thing I've ever heard. That's out of line." So the whole thing is a sham. It's rigged, and and I say that it's not rigged in the crude way that people often imagine. It's rigged in the sense that you've got an establishment here which really thinks of itself as having a right to rule, and fairness doesn't even enter into the picture. Even when they try to be fair, they are so reflexive in their bigotry that they don't even know how unfair they're being. I had one of these instances 4 years ago where it was going to be live. There was going to be an actual in-person panel of, again, supposedly 2 Trump people and 2 Biden-Harris people, except that one of the Trump people was going to be someone who described himself as like the world's most reluctant Trump supporter. So it was just going to be just a total sham. And I said to them, look, and then also the way this was set up was that the left side of the debate, the Biden-Harris side of the debate, was going to be very diverse. It was going to have women and minorities and sexual minorities. And the supposed Trump side was going to be just white guys. And I said to them, look, you know exactly what kind of image you're presenting here, and you know why you're doing it. And I'm not going to play along with this. I will take part in your program, but if I'm going to do that, you're going to have to get a real Trump supporter to be on my team. And second, you're going to have to try very hard. I will give you a list to find a Trump supporter who will show that Trump supporters are not all just white men, and that in fact the myth you want to create that all of them are just white and that they have no black support or women's support, that is complete BS. To their credit, when I called them on it and said, you've got to take this more seriously, they actually were shamed at that point, and they did succeed in finding a very well qualified African-American woman who was supporting Donald Trump. So, I give credit where that's due, but it was reluctant. It was something I had to fight for. And they were astonished that, someone they had invited to be part of their event actually had the, sort of ill graces to say, wait a minute, what you set up is a complete, sham. And, you need to, change your ways here. So maybe, some media outlets and media figures still have just enough basic professionalism and enough decency as human beings that they will say, wait a minute, we've gone way too far with this Kamala stuff. We actually need to, start asking some real questions, demand that she do some interviews, demand that she speak extempore and see what this woman actually stands for. Maybe that's going to happen, and I like to hope that it will. But if it doesn't, then, voters are going to have to exercise a unusual degree of skepticism, and they're going to have to say, wait a minute, the dog that doesn't bark is actually much louder than the ones that do. And the fact that Kamala Harris is, such a blank slate, that itself is suspicious and tells us that she must be something really bad if they're not going to tell us, what's underneath that, impassive exterior.
Dan, I had one more question for you, but I'm gonna let it go for another time. In fact, maybe you can be thinking about it, letting it percolate in your mind between now and whenever the next time is. And I guess the question would have been, can you describe? Don't answer it now. Think about it. 2 scenarios. They both involve a Harris victory, but one is a scenario is a horrible scenario in which so much of what she wants to accomplish takes place, and the second is one where she's stymied and there are only moderate changes made to American life. Could you make, just yes or no, could you make tell a plausible story for each of those scenarios?
Yes, and in fact, I touch on that in a new piece I've written for Chronicles magazine, which I think will be in their September issue. So it's just a taste of that. We'll have much more to discuss next time. But yes, I can definitely talk about those 2 scenarios.
All right, excellent. All right, Dan, I appreciate your time so much. I read your column basically via the New York Post. So any of you folks who read the New York Post, you'll see Dan in there regularly. But he's a syndicated columnist. He's all over the place. I very, very rarely do I say I disagree with Dan. And, just the other day, you remember we had that dinner in, did we come to you? Or was it in Arlington? Did we come?
It was
to
in
you?
Arlington. That's right.
Yeah. So we had that dinner back in January, and we talked about everything under the sun. And my wife was so impressed with you and so thoroughly enjoyed that dinner that she said, we have to try to arrange to see Dan at least quarterly so we can have a meal like that. So I hope that'll turn out to be the case.
I agree. We definitely should do that.
All right. Thanks so much again, Dan. And thank you all, ladies and gentlemen.
Thanks, Tom.
Make yourself and those you love less vulnerable to the regime, both mentally and physically. Get more forbidden information at tomsfreebooks.com and be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you listen. See you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.